Hello, most welcome to Heidegger 1166.
7.
67. Oh, thank you, Galle. Today I will make a connection here with Seyn from Seyn and Zeit, Martin Heidegger, and this is an article that specifically addresses being or Seyn. It's from the book, the Cambridge Dictionary of Heidegger, editor Wrathall, and this specific article is also written by Wrathall. And I see an interesting connection, and I begin to believe that understanding of Seyn will not be possible without understanding the two processes. Otherwise, you will enforce something that is already established. That needs to be, let's say, softened up a bit. That can only be done by understanding the process-like version of our reality as, very important, proven by physics. That is the most important. Nothing else is proven. There are no other alternatives. This is the proven thing from science. So everybody who thinks that it might be weird with the philosophy of Heidegger, I would say it is almost confirmed by science. This is article 27 or entry. All being, Seyn, with a Y, very important, it's a Y. Being is the background against which entities can be uncovered and attain a stable, enduring presence. I don't want to interrupt too much, but already in the first sentence you can hear being is process 1, and stable enduring presence is of course process 2. This background is dynamic and subject to change. In different historical ages it has different styles, each of which invisibly shapes how entities are constituted. As an origin or source of entities, Heidegger explains, being is as a rift that clears away, a rift within which entities can come to a stand. For there to be stable, enduring entities, Heidegger believes it must be possible to bring relative stability to the chaotic flux or infinite play of the relationships that constitutes the world. Rather than positing some primal entity which could fix and establish the definite relationships that determine all other things, Heidegger argues that the settlement is made possible by a positive absence, like a crack or a tear in the rock that lets a climber get a toehold as he ascends a sheer cliff face. Being is the positive absence. It's an abyss or a between. That works by refusing to present itself. by holding back other possible presentations of concrete entities. Through a coherent pattern of such refusal, being gives or allocates to a world a texture on the basis on which a particular set of defining constitutive relations become salient. As a refusal, being is not a mere withdrawal or deduction, but rather the opposite. Refusal is the intimacy of an allocation. A fundamental position on what is as a whole grows out of authentic singular being and gains its structure. The English word being, spelt with Y, like its German counterpart Seyn with a Y, is an archaic spelling for being. Heidegger began using the archaic spelling in the 30s to mark off his own preferred non-metaphysical notion of being from traditional approaches to ontology. When he now writes being as being, Heidegger notes this is supposed to indicate that being is here no longer being thought metaphysically. The terminological innovation was probably inspired by Hölderlin's use of the now archaic spelling, which was common in the early 18th century. In any event, Heidegger first makes extensive use of the term in his 34 to 35 lectures on Hölderlin. Heidegger does not always and consistently use this convention to distinguish between his own understanding of being and the metaphysical understandings of beings. And many of the published versions of Heidegger's essays and lectures employ being even where the original lectures or manuscripts used being with a Y. After 1950, Heidegger almost never uses the spelling variant, even in his manuscripts, notes, and other unpublished writings. Perhaps the best way to get an initial sense for how Heidegger understands being is to contrast it with his characterization of the metaphysical understanding of being. The metaphysical question of being asks, what are entities? But in asking this question, metaphysical thoughts starts too late. It looks at the way entities have already been constituted as such. In my parenthesis, process 2 is finished. And then abstracts out from them the most generic feature to arrive at the concept of being with a small b. Being, by contrast, is more inceptual than entities. It is that which first allows entities to manifest themselves as what they are. The question of being asks, why is what is? What is it to to be an entity? At what background can entities appear? When the latter questions are replaced by the metaphysical what is question. An event that occurs at the first dawn of Western philosophy. This is already a sign of the abandonment of being and the oblivion of being. In metaphysical accounts, being is thought of in two different ways. Either as the highest cause that produces everything else, or as the most general and universal category that everything falls under. This is the essential property of objectness. Heidegger picturesquely describes these two approaches as interpreting being either as a varnish or a slave driver. That is, being is either an inert overlay on the entities that are, or it causes them to be what they are. Being, by contrast, is neither a cause nor a category, and it can't be discovered by investigating the properties of entities. Being never leaves a trace in entities. Being is never to be found as an entity among entities. And I had to put another parenthesis. Here, being exactly the same as process 2, contrast to process 1. Process 1 can never ever be discovered from process 2. With a material inclination, it will never reveal itself. But the overall style of a world can indicate the structure of being, and Heidegger views the development of sensibility for this style to be one of the preeminent tasks for philosophy. To fully understand the contrasts Heidegger draws between being and being, we need to bear in mind that Heidegger's ontology is strongly relational. That is, what something is a function of how it relates to other entities. Carlo Rovelli, I would say. The relations that are most salient to us produce for us a network of intelligibility. Entities appear at the stable nodes of this network of relationships. That certain relations stand out as definitive and essential, while others recede in importance, is a function of the in-between. That is, the clearing, Lichtung, traversed by the relations that unite entities to each other, so that they can mutually define each other. Being, with a Y, is that in-between, the essential abyssal ground of the in-between, that sustains and structures relations. One is tempted to think of the background that allows entities to show up in the foreground as having a kind of texture. the friction of which erases some possible relations while making others stand out. Or perhaps one can think of being as creating a kind of gravitational warp to the field of possible relationships. A warp lets some relationships stand out as salient because others disappear into the gaps or folds of the field. I think this is a very good metaphor. Think about a warp and how a warp is made, and by making one pattern you sort of cover another pattern. This is the fashion of all warps, and the warp is also the world. It is a warp. Thus, even though being is not an entity and makes no concrete appearance in the world, it is not an inert nothing. It is not an indeterminate emptiness. It is an indeterminate emptiness of which something appears. It is rather finite and rich because it is a particular texturing of the field. This is a go how to read it. Thus, even though being is not an entity and makes no concrete appearance in the world, it is not an inert nothing, an indeterminate emptiness in which something appears. It is rather finite and rich because it is a particular texturing of the field, and thus allows very specific relationships to emerge as definitive of entities in the world. So the very definiteness is in being. It is not a feature of beings. Borders, the sheer ability to exist resides in being, not in beings. Since a different singular being underlies being in a different eras or epochs, the essence of entities is determined according to a different style. Thus, being is responsible for essencing. Entities are being essences. An understanding of being, Heidegger notes, is the unavoidable foreground of the truth of being. That operates in the background. Being with an I is the terminal product of a particular being having allowed a particular world to coalesce and stabilize and rigidify. Being hardens into being in the form of beingness. Having thus hardened, being shows up as static, timeless, and vacuously empty because it is predictable of everything. Determinism in my is predictable of everything that is. Being, by contrast with Y, is the most finite and richest, the most abyssal. And it is dynamic and historical in nature because being is finite. That is, it is particular to a particular world or historical epoch. It is subject to change. Indeed, Heidegger argues that the history of different understandings of being is really a history of changes in the abyss or rift design or background texture that is being. We humans play a role in this transition from one world to the next by becoming adapted or attuned to a new background. Being involves an allocation of entities, and this allocation is the attuning determination, Bestimmung, the throw that throws the human being into fundamental attunement. Nevertheless, being is operative without necessarily ever being recognized as such. Indeed, Heidegger argues for the most of the history of metaphysics. Thinkers have been oblivious to being. In fact, he goes so far as to argue that being is not dependent on us, and certainly not a product of our category of human representation. So we see here an interesting parallel between processes 1 and 2, and also why it is fundamentally important to understand that although everything that is in the process 2 way or in the being way, as in being with a small letter b, is not derivative from being with a y. So you can't start with beings and end up with being with a big B. This is exactly the same thing as in process 1 and 2. Process 1 gives rise with all its different potentialities by asking realities yes and no questions. Let's say there are 20 questions in process 1. The answer will atemporally be answered, and immediately, exactly as in the example of Roger Federer and Roger Penrose with the tennis court of Wimbledon, immediately, atemporally, a world is established, and this established world is what we share. This is existence. with a small e, if you like. So, to make a parallel with Henry Stapp, what reductionists, materialists do as a mistake is that they start with beings or process 2 and try to find their way back to the origin. But think about it this way, this is coming more from Heidegger. Being doesn't cause beings. There is not a cause and effect here. And this is the mistake also of the Ionian philosophers of nature. They concluded that the arche can be derived from existence. For instance, what we experience, water is a rather good example. From that was made the arche of water. From what we see, the different forms, solid water, ice, steam, vapor, condensation, snow, fog. It's an excellent metaphor. It lends to the thought of that there is a derivative origin of everything we see, but it's not causative. It's not causative. They concluded that it was causative, and thereby stepping into a path that Heraclitus used. He turned it upside down and added the contradiction to be able to show us the way out of this thinking, which is very, very hard. It's a bit like lifting oneself in the hair. But I think Heraclitus, he did succeed. The same path is followed by Heidegger. He shows us with his neologisms Dasein, as we mentioned, Lichtung, Aletheia and Theia, Entwurft, zu handen, vorhanden. He helps us to avoid that trap, so to speak, which is incredibly hard. Being with a Y is not an arche. It is not an atom. It is not causative. Why? Because causation itself is hidden within being. So the cause we see around in the world, it is not stemming from that world. It's stemming from something beyond. All the philosophers of nature assumed indirectly that the causation that they saw around in the world was in the world. Henry Stapp calls this the materialist fallacy. It's starting from the wrong end, and it will always lead to materialism. And since we start in the wrong end, the results that comes up, the will disappear, and we will even have problem defining what will is. We will not know its factors. This is evident today in all philosophers. The second feature, we will not know what soul is, because we're starting in the wrong end, and we try to gather those Lego pieces together that was constructed from something else. We will not succeed. We will end up with a fragmented afterworld. This is very akin to constructing what Roger Federer is intending while he's playing his Wimbledon game from the perspective of a spectator. It cannot be done. It's been proven it cannot be done. They will not understand what is happening in the tennis court. Those examples came from the neurologist recently. David Wrathall is a good example, and he shows that spectators, journalists, and ex-pros of basketball could not understand if a ball was going to go into the ring or not. The ex-pros were best, but still at only 50%. Then came the journalists, and last the spectators. The players, though, the one in the basketball alley, they could decide to a much greater extent, and the most proficient in deciding whether the ball goes in or not is of course the goal maker himself. He would know exactly in the moment the ball leaves his hands whether it is to enter into the ring or not. And as you hear, we have now entered into the macroscopic world. We are no longer in the microscopic world of atoms, quantum effects. The von Neumann orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics applies to all levels, as proven by the double slit experiments and billions of our other experiments today. What Heidegger calls the abandonment of the Seinsfrage, I would say, and this is my opinion, that happened among the Ionian philosophers of nature, the physicos, Anaximander, Anaximener, all those stemming from the area around Thales. There it was already abandoned, and I would call that forgetfulness. We start on the wrong foot, and lack of balance will henceforth be the predominant feature in all of Western philosophy. Plato struggled with it. He could no longer understand, as he tried to make it understandable, the entities, the objects. He inferred an array of ideal objects that were causing the objects of existence, of experience. And he also lost the understanding of the psyche, the anima. That became ununderstandable. So he changed his view, and he built in the constant paradoxes that has plagued the conclusions of Western philosophy until the event of quantum mechanics. Gödel's theorem is the same thing. He wants to derive all of mathematics from process 2, from what is experienced, from the beings. But mathematics would not lend itself to this. Almost simultaneously as the Heisenberg conclusion, which led to the establishment of the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, he came to the understanding and proven fact that beings cannot lead to beings. They cannot cause beings. And the same goes for materialism. As proven by Eminem in 1887, there are no stable frame or canvas to put everything in that doesn't have an effect. And that was of course the return of the light. The light, or why not fire, as Heraclitus called it. The fire of understanding, the fire of once more having a grip of consciousness, of I, of what is existence. But due a preemptive stuckedness into the existences, the beings, the atoms, the molecular things, we become tensed, mentally and bodily, unavoidable, because we no longer understand, and we try to forcefully, I would say almost aggressively, to force another vision that is not natural on the world. And we try to keep this subjective from my perspective, but not even fitting my inner world. It's like holding a map in front of your face and saying, this is the real world, not what I experience. Experiences are not enough, and an experience can also be shown to have an history, as Ian McGilchrist and Julian Jaynes, Richard E. Lynn mentions. The change in language brought about by the fixation coming from the Ionian philosophers of nature leads to a change in language. Those things are happening, were happening at the very same time. And this simultaneous thing makes it very hard to understand. And I would say that became a mystery. Just because it sort of came into existence from nowhere at the same time, we all concluded after that it is of reality. Heisenberg says no, and that can be observed even, which is the fantastic thing with quantum mechanics. It can be proven, it can be seen, it can be experienced. And it's this backward motion of time all of a sudden that goes in the other direction and regulates and makes it hard also, if you go to start with the wrong foot, to understand that all this order you see around you, it is established from the process one from being, and understanding that leads to an liberation of body and soul. And it's this that makes understanding possible. So what Heidegger is opening up to is understanding itself, that we can understand. And he is a positive sign going in another direction than Friedrich Nietzsche in Gay Science, where he says that there is no knowledge possible. Well, there is not if you start with beings, but all of knowledge is possible if you start with what is before. The superposition, if you like, the definiteness of superposition, from where definiteness, borders, limitations, cause and effect, temporality, spaciousness is coming. But you can't go to the after, the a posteriori, and step by step, by cutting apart the different causes, you cannot go to the origin, as proven by the double slit experiment. And this is essentially the foundational understanding the magnificent discovery of quantum mechanics in the 20s. You cannot go that way. It is a blind alley. It will lead you into despair, as all philosophers up to Heidegger, and I would say the later Wittgenstein. In this blind alley, you don't get anywhere. It is a stoppage, it is a blockage, it obscures also the things in process two. If you start with experience, you will also lose experience. The development of the world is a vital process. It is full of life. And by clinging to the existences, you rid the life out of existence. And you will not have experience either. And that clingage led Plato into the dark cave. It led Descartes to abandon his embodiment, not being in this world anymore, being of something else, being immaterial, res cogitans, where his experience, res existence, res extensa, came to be the fundamental. Even though he didn't say it himself, that became later foundational, and I would say it led those thinkers astray, like Laplace inventing the demon inadvertently without wanting to, Maxwell ending in with his problems, not making what is cause clear, and Poincaré claiming determinacy but not being able to fathom it. That is cured, that is made whole again, and that wholeness doesn't mean that process 2 and 1 are the same, very far apart. And it doesn't mean that there are no definitions, that there are no borders. No, actually just the opposite. This is what makes borders and human understanding possible. It is opening up eternity of knowledge, more and more, and that knowledge will not come into conflict. It will not lead to conflicts of thinking, because it's stemming from the vital process of reality itself that shows itself. As in the Lichtung, where aletheia takes part with theia, and everything happens in the border of what is being disclosed in contrast to what is being hidden. In this border area, all the fun stuff, so to say, are coming to life, and this is springing of life, springing of properties, colors, understanding, shapes, forms, space, time. It is an opening up, and it's letting in of both light and darkness, not demanding only this highly luminescent light that erodes all shapes, like a big light bulb in the sky, maybe lit by the Laplacian demon himself, taking away all characters of reality, all shapes. There are no longer any distinctions. Even the smallest thing disappear because it cannot contrast. It is all stemming from one atomic arcade, and off goes space and temporality, and we are led to only keep the pennies and pence. We do not longer have access to our old wallet, our old bank account, our possibilities, and we become very limited, as mentioned with the article in the previous lecture, in our embodiment. We get fixated, and instead of having so many different paths in our inner system, in our cells, the possibility of how the world might take different characteristics, be different, so that that world can be exactly definite. It is those many possibilities that makes for a definite, accurate world. A world of quantum mechanics, for instance, that measures the distance between Earth and the Moon within a measurement deviance of less than a human hair, the width of a human hair. It is so exact, but it can only become this exact if we allow the possibility for process one. Yes, it is a very hard thing to swallow, and I think it can only come in step, because it demands a rearrangement of yourself. You need to be loosened up. You need to become tensed where you're supposed to be, and untensed, expanding where the possibility lies. This is what makes possible to go into the next step, to be able to have both process 1 and 2 and make both of them so much stronger, so much informative, telling. And that, I think, is a very important feature, because in the materialism, it's an inherent rejection of information. Information gets scarce, it gets little. It's a constant diminishing of information. Everything is reducible into something else. And for every reduction, as we learn from fractality, we lose quite a lot. It becomes step by step smaller and smaller, and in the end we end up with just an atom, and we lose, oddly enough, causality. We lose predictive power, because prediction is having many different options, polysemical options, open at the same time, and that demands an openness in your body-mind system. That is a sine qua non. Otherwise, you will not be able to be definite in the process 2, in the beings. I can give an example here. when I misunderstood Heidegger in the beginning, I thought that beings was a lexicon of being with a big B. But it's absolutely not that Heidegger is pointing to. It is missing the point totally. But coming from a materialistic default mode, which is not expressed, of course, it is very hard not to make that conclusion. And it was also made directly. And I would say the only way of uphold in an unbalanced, unknowing way is to decide what the world is before you meet it. And that is a very biased way on the part of yourself. You need to tense yourself to block out mentally, bodily, all other possibilities to make the world one in the sense of mono, in the sense of that there is an arche that lies behind all of existence, and that it causes that world in a subjective, random way, how I perceive my existence in this limiting way. So Heidegger is showing for a liberation, and he doesn't devalue beings, and he doesn't upvalue being with a big B. He leads us to understanding how it has always been, and thereby liberating the capacities to cognitively understand the process of prediction, planning, that is projection, oddly very similar to Henri Bergson's view of élan vital, constantly constructing new projections from retentions. By understanding the before, we can also reach into the retention, the memories. Those memories will be stale otherwise. They will be like the shadow products in the cave, only having a half-life, a ghost-like existence. And there's no, I don't think it's an accident that the very common complaint today is that people do no longer remember. I think it is caused by this fixation with the end product and saying this is the whole world. Like being in a dark room and holding an elephant tail and saying the tail is all there is. And someone else is saying, well, the trunk is all there is. And then you have the third one saying that the leg of the elephant is all what an elephant is. This is exactly the same. And the concluding example is the stone garden in Kyoto, in Ryohanji. Alan Watts, I think he concluded that this shows the limitation of human knowledge. But looking at it from a perspective of Henry Stapp, Heidegger, it is an indication of understanding more, that the viewpoint before can see all aspects, but if we get stuck in the existential mood, which I think animals are themselves, they're not aware of the before, then we can't understand the world. I think this is the true message of the Ryohanji Stone Garden. And I think this default mood of materialism made Alan Watts fall into the trap of this highly negative conclusion of lack of understanding, and thereby leading to some sort of abandonment once more, a small abandonment within the abandonment. No, what Heidegger writes in Being in Time, it's an opening up to all small beings, to all everyday things, because being is not metaphysical. It is of this world. It is of the normal, everyday at-homeness. It is not a metaphysical thing. If it were, why would he pay the trouble to have different spellings and crossing it out? No, there are very pertinent reasons. We gain access to the experiential world for the first time, I would say, because that cannot be opened up without opening up both to process 1 and 2. They are simultaneously very necessary, and all the questions that are put, everything we put as projections, will end up in one single response from nature's answer, yes or no. And that will then, after that, be the clear existential world. And by understanding that, we can have complete 100% access to that. We will win the ordinary world, and we will win the ordinary world of common daily life. We will be able more to do predictions once we understand our stuckedness in our heads. Our heads, our thinking will not be limited to existences or non-existences. We don't have to judge our thinking anymore to say it's accurate or non-accurate. I mentioned this before as the list of correctness. And I think many people today are obsessing over this. Was that a real experience? Is that thinking correct? No, leave thinking space. Let it come into existence. This is Denken and Duncan. This is thankfulness. This is enjoying thinking. Seeing thinking as your prime nature, your original face, so to speak, where you become whole and you think and you have all the varieties, and once the superposition collapses, you have only one clear, definite reality. But still, you never lose sight of process 1. You still have being, because they both necessitates the real world. Think of it this way. This is the last and concluding. Think of Niels Bohr and the yin and yang symbol. Think of process 1 as one area and process 2 as the other area. The movement is what produces reality, and that movement can only be done if you have both of them, and then both of them will spring into life. They will come alive and be substantiated, and you will also be wholer, more balanced, less prone to cut thoughts up, telling them correct, or even scold yourself for thinking incorrectly and living in shame and having this guilt sense, am I living in the real reality? Something that plagued most of the analytical philosophies. In another lecture, we take up the reactions from the Vienna Circle when they met the quantum physicists. It's quite interesting, because what they did was just accept everything they said. And some of the quantum physicists, they got suspicious. You never accept quantum physics that easily. And they tried to look underneath their understanding, and it turned out they had no idea what it was all about. There's still the quote from Bohr is important. if you're not shocked by the conclusion or the conclusions of quantum mechanics, you haven't begun to understand. And the Vienna Circle, none of them were shocked. They just saw it as science, and without paying attention or getting into the matter, they made all of quantum physics into a beings directly. It happens in an instance. And of course, they are not to be blamed. But what happened afterwards, it is that the realization, the freshness, like when first I heard this, I felt like a clearing where you just took your axe and it's still fresh. And you have these definite lines and you have this definite understanding. And that became stale. It became like those clearings out in Heidegger that been maybe for a couple of years, and where you see bushes coming up and grass, and you don't have any distinctions anymore. You have neither darkness nor light. And it takes about 20 years for a clearing in Sweden to become wood again, a forest. In that middle period, it is what happened after the freshness of the discovery and the revolutionary jump that all of them did. After time passed, the default state of the rest of the world and the willingness, the just willingness to take use of quantum theory in a practical situation slowly made the Lichtung to overgrow. I think with Henry Stepp and Heidegger, it's time to sharpen the axe. Sorry for the violent metaphor, the trope, and cut up again definitions, borders, because only definitions and borders, distinct properties, can inform us. The undistinctiveness of the modern world or postmodern world doesn't tell you what's up and down even. It doesn't give you anything. Everything is a complete blur. And of course that is relativism. And relativism, I will put my foot down in contrast to Party Thomas and others. It is not an ideology. It's an absolute cause of starting in the wrong way. Nobody chose postmodernism. There are no postmodern philosophers, and especially saying that Derrida was a postmodern philosopher, which he vehemently did not agree with, is just absurd. It is the default mood, and the ones accusing postmodernism or defining it as an ideology are also victims for that tendency. I get into more understanding of what causes these things, and it's not ideology. It is a must. Once you started in the wrong step, start on the right step. It was a sheer pleasure. Thank you very much, and have a very pleasant afternoon. Maybe slowly we can, slowly.
Number is very important.
Thank you.